For those brimming to their neck in bitterness, and those who take pleasure in tearing others down, there is a website like no other, the Bad Webcomics Wiki. This site sports over 383 articles detailing all the bad webcomics from the unpopular to the downright infamous. This website has a frankly shocking amount of detail and effort put into it, some of the articles spanning longer than my attention span. Something interesting I found here was there was a few common themes between these bad webcomics. Most are incredibly obvious ones that you could already guess, bad art, unfunny jokes, etc. But one that really caught me by surprise was how frequently these comics went from an episodic story structure and slowly or suddenly morphed into a continuous storyline, and how this was brought up as a purely negative aspect of the work. As an obscure YouTuber, I am a fan of obscure literary theory and tearing other content creators down, so this really activated my elements. To my surprise though, I couldn't find anything on the subject. Not even a video essay, which I thought was a real missed opportunity. I couldn't just let this stand, so today, let's explore whether or not this is true. Is switching from an episodic to a continuous story a negative? Is it okay to take comedy characters and throw them into a world of drama and consequence? From webcomics to TV, let's check out the good, the bad, and the ugly of this narrative device, exclusively here on Super Turbo Ultra! So, let's start with the bad, as we have already touched on the topic. When it comes to finding examples of bad, well, anything, the Bad Webcomic Wiki is the golden standard. While some of the reviews can feel a bit biased or more focused on dumping on the work rather than critically reviewing it, I gotta tell you, from everything I've seen, these comics are genuinely bad. I mention this as sometimes I feel rather than properly focusing on what makes a comic negative, these reviews just bring up everything that makes it unique and then present it as a negative. But still, it can't be ignored how often tonal and narrative shifts are mentioned in these reviews. In the downfall section of Wopsy Square, the start of the adventure plotline rolling, it turns a story about a bunch of characters coping with work, romance, and friendships into a giant slow-moving mess. Also in the downfall section, the Goblin review reads, however, they decided to turn this into a dramatic piece. In concession, the writer goes on for a while about how the comic has to decide whether it wants to be a dippy drama comic or a lighthearted gag-a-day comic. This is because it started out as the latter, and when that didn't get enough attention, he tried to mold and shape it into the former. In Firthia High, it facultates from high school comedy to romance to deep meaning and whatnot. The author could have done better if he had stuck with light comedy. At least he had some talent with that. Not my words. In Perky Goth / Candy Raver, there is a lot wrong with this webcomic, but specifically there is criticism all over the page for the shift in genre and structure it went through. The downfall is blamed on when it stopped being a comedy and tried taking itself seriously. In the plot section, when the next arc starts, the webcomic's tone abruptly changes and turns into a soap opera, and we're suddenly supposed to sympathize with the protagonist. And finally, in the writing section, the author should have stuck to farce. He was okay with that, but when he tried giving his webcomics a more serious tone, he failed miserably. Now, this is all some crap on some itty-bitty comics that almost no one has heard of and are quite terrible, completely independent of whether or not they have a through plotline in their strip. To get things out of the world of webcomics for a second, how about Seinfeld, the absolute king of taking a show about nothing and surprising everyone with the consequences of their actions in the finale? It was a pretty well-liked show, but wow, that last episode did not go over well, earning itself a measly average 1.5 stars for the episode and a million other articles discussing the controversial episode. Back in the world of webcomics, Order of the Stick is a webcomic that, well, it looks like it belongs in the Bad Webcomics Wiki, but it's good, I promise you. It's a comic about a party of Dungeon and Dragon protagonists making their way through a dungeon, and all the silly gags the author can make about the hobby. It's alright, but nothing too special. Until the heroes actually do make it to the end of the dungeon. Suddenly the heroes find themselves outside for the first time in the series, in a limitless world and completely free to make whatever choices they desire and to experience all the consequences of said choices. It's not a sudden transition, as throughout the dungeon arc, certain strips have a demo of an ongoing storyline, going from purely gag a day to occasionally running into problems and twists that take more than a single strip to overcome. Currently, over 1,000 full strips later, the story has morphed into an epic plot about the end of the world and multiverses, but it still manages to hold on to its roots by keeping its character-progressed original cast and its original goofy humor punctuating every page. Possibly the best, if not especially well-known example of developing into a serious story the right way would be Octopus Pie. It starts off with 20-something sarcastic Eve getting a new manic pixie girl roommate, which, now that I think about it, probably deserves an award for the most generic webcomic concept ever, but it's good, I promise you. It starts off primarily making jokes about the realities of living with a new roommate, living in New York, and all the incredibly colorful people that inhabit it, but very slowly, almost imperceptibly, a story forms, and the colorful cast transitions into very real characters with hopes, worries, and strange chibi bodies. It's not bad, just kind of weird that the characters keep looking more baby-like as they grow into more mature adults. I don't know. It manages to keep the slightly surreal vibes while only giving up a bit of comedy, but it gains so much more in the way of characterization and memorable stories that really genuinely resonates with readers. A very popular example outside of the world of webcomics, Samurai Jack. One of the most episodic, standalone, reset back to zero shows, then suddenly, boom! Final season with dramatic ongoing storyline spanning the entire season. It's a complete and sudden 180 of how the show worked up until that point, but the audience ate it up, receiving a perfect score on Rotten Tomatoes. It was the perfect climax to a beloved show, and it's highly unlikely it could have wrapped up the series so well if it stayed stuck in the old ways of neatly wrapping up every episode. By this point, you might be at a loss for why the most infamous example of this hasn't been brought up yet. If you're unsure of what this could be, it's the home of one of the biggest memes that refuses to die over a decade later. That's right, it's Control-Alt-Delete, creator of the infamous Lost strip. Completely out of context, the strip itself doesn't seem too bad. It's not like there's any inappropriate dialogue or graphic imagery. Instead, it was the, and I quote, awkward tonal shift at best, and hugely disrespectful of the subject matter at worst. Even its least harsh critics say, the comic wasn't inherently the worst thing ever, just a drastic departure from the tone its audience had been used to. Control-Alt-Delete up until that point was an entirely goofy, sometimes nonsensical comic about video games that had only really been experimenting with ongoing storylines. So would Lost still have been poorly received if it came from a more suitable comic? Maybe. But it's clear the horrible mismatch is what propelled it to infamous status. For an even better example, how about the last several seasons of South Park? I don't know what's more wild. Changing up an episodic show after decades to have a continuous storyline, or suddenly going fuck it and reset almost everything back to how it was in a single special a few years later. I'm not going to try to judge whether or not these last seasons of the show were a good or a bad move. I think that's really subjective, but I will say, remember how they gambled an entire storyline on who would win the American election and were then stuck in the corner they wrote themselves into for 4 years? Yeah, they really wasted no time on getting themselves out of that one the second they had the chance. So what can we learn from all of these examples? Webcomics are bad? No, not that. In all these examples, the narrative takes either a sudden or a gradual shift to a more drama and higher stakes. The difference between the good and the bad ones is how well their characters fit in the new format. Samurai Jack did well in his episodic structure, but his goal to return to the past and save the world was always begging to be presented in a longer format, so he made the jump good.
You can fly? No, jump good.
Ethan, on the other hand, didn't have much character development besides being a vessel for lol random XD humor. Suddenly throwing him into the deep end and dealing with a subject most serious dramas would shy away from, well, it was ugly. There's a lot to gain from switching to a more continuous story, in any genre, in any medium. Just keep in mind, doing so is throwing your characters into the deep end, and the only way to ensure that they can swim is to give them enough character development. It's for this very reason it's so common in narrative television to start a show off with a bang, the big opener and all that, and then just quickly shift to an episodic format for a while, giving the audience a chance to get to know the characters and let them grow briefly, before throwing them into the deep end that is the rest of the plot that, carries the rest of the show. Well, I guess that's all I have to say for now. If you have any other good examples of how this works, or even better, examples of why I'm completely missing the mark, please let me know below. I'm going to try to respond to all comments and might make another response video if there's enough interest, so